I walked into her quiet house expecting loneliness, but when her friend arrived, they both turned to me, and everything changed. I had always admired quiet mornings, the kind where the world seems to slow just enough for you to notice the small things. Today, that stillness felt heavier than usual. The widow's house stood at the end of the street, its brickwork softened by the creeping ivy climbing the walls. I wasn't sure why I had come, perhaps out of habit, or maybe because I sensed she needed company more than she realized. As I opened the door, the faint scent of lavender greeted me first, mingling with the subtle mustiness of old books. The house was quiet, but not empty. There was a rhythm to it, like the memory of someone who had lived fully here, whose absence lingered in every carefully placed object. I stepped inside, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of stillness, and the soft creak of the wooden floorboards seemed louder than it should have been. She appeared from the kitchen, moving with a quiet grace that betrayed years of confidence and care. Her hair, streaked with silver, fell softly around her face as she reached for a teacup, her fingers brushing the rim almost reverently. Even in a casual housecoat, she carried herself with the kind of elegance that felt natural, effortless. When she noticed me, her eyes softened, and a small, almost shy smile curved her lips. For a moment, I felt the weight of unspoken words between us, a mixture of welcome and quiet curiosity. We spoke briefly, exchanging small pleasantries. Her voice had a calm, steady warmth, the kind that makes you want to linger in the room just to hear it again. I watched the way she moved through the space, hands gliding over furniture, straightening a cushion, adjusting a vase. There was a rhythm to her gestures, a quiet intimacy with the objects around her, and I couldn't help noticing the traces of someone deeply present yet quietly absent at the same time. I took a seat by the window, drawn to the light spilling across the wooden floor. Outside, the garden was a mixture of late blooms and autumnal decay, petals falling lazily, leaves trembling in the breeze. Inside, the air was warm, tinged with the faint aroma of tea and the subtle traces of her perfume, soft, floral, and reassuring. I felt an odd sense of comfort, as though the house itself was a protective embrace, sheltering both her and me from the world beyond. She sat across from me, and our eyes met briefly, holding a connection neither of us spoke aloud. There was a hesitation in that look, a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken. I could see traces of loneliness in the way she lingered on familiar objects, in the soft sigh she let escape when settling into a chair. And yet, there was resilience too, a strength born from loss, from having faced the silence and found ways to keep moving forward. As I watched her, I realized that being here wasn't just about checking in or offering company. It was about noticing the quiet details, the way her hands moved, the subtle shifts in expression, the weight of memories that lingered in the room. I felt both an outsider and a confidant, drawn to the warmth she radiated, even in solitude. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't expected, that this quiet house, filled with absence and memory, was about to change in ways neither of us could predict. I had been sitting near the window, letting the quiet hum of the house settle around me, when I heard the soft click of the front gate. It was subtle, but in the stillness of the morning, every sound seemed amplified. I turned, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a delivery, but instead, a woman appeared in the doorway, tall, poised, with an elegance that immediately filled the space. She was around the widow's age, maybe a few years older, and there was an effortless warmth to her presence. The faint scent of vanilla and sandalwood followed her, mixing with the lavender that lingered in the house, creating a subtle, comforting fragrance that wrapped around me. She smiled as she stepped inside, and I noticed the familiar way the widow's face lit up at her arrival, a smile that reached her eyes and softened the quiet lines of grief I had noticed just moments ago. The two women embraced, a gentle, lingering hug that spoke of long friendship and unspoken support. It was a connection that didn't need words, just the quiet press of shoulders, the light brushing of hands, the reassuring warmth of familiarity. I watched them, feeling both like an observer and a part of something delicate and significant. Their laughter followed, soft and unrestrained, filling the room with a sound that made the corners of the space feel less empty. Then, as if by instinct, both women turned toward me at the same time. The widow's eyes held a curious warmth, a silent question that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Her friend's gaze was playful yet searching, as though she were measuring me against some unseen standard. I felt the weight of their attention, an almost electric moment of quiet tension that I wasn't prepared for, yet somehow didn't want to escape. We exchanged greetings, polite but tinged with subtle familiarity. The friend's handshake lingered a fraction too long, her fingers brushing my palm in a way that sent a small shiver up my arm. There was a softness in her voice as she spoke, an unspoken reassurance that somehow made the room feel smaller, more intimate. Meanwhile, the widow watched from across the room, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and I realized that in that moment, I was caught between two worlds, the lingering sadness of loss and the vibrant, quiet energy of connection. They moved through the space together, arranging chairs, setting down cups of tea, their hands occasionally brushing in ways that were completely natural, yet charged with an unspoken history. I found myself noticing small details, the way the friend tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the widow's hand resting for a moment on her friend's shoulder. It was intimate, but entirely innocent, the kind of closeness born from years of shared experiences and unspoken understanding. By the time we all settled into the living room, there was a new rhythm in the air. Their attention toward me was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet acknowledgement of my presence and, perhaps, my importance in this unexpected convergence. The house, which had felt like a haven of solitude, suddenly hummed with life and quiet anticipation. And in that moment, I realized that my quiet visit had become something far more complicated and infinitely more compelling than I could have imagined. The morning settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of gentle, almost imperceptible cadence that allows observation to feel natural. We moved from the living room to the small sunlit kitchen, and I found myself watching the way the two women interacted, not just with each other, but with me. Their movements were effortless, yet there was an almost magnetic pull in the air, subtle but undeniable. The widow reached for a teapot, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter just as mine passed nearby. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a warm spark through me, a reminder that in this room, my presence was noticed. She glanced up, her eyes meeting mine, and a quiet smile lifted the corners of her lips, a smile that said more than words could, a gentle acknowledgement of the tension that neither of us dared name. Her friend, leaning casually against the counter, laughed softly at something the widow said, and in that moment, her hand brushed lightly against my arm. It was fleeting, but the touch lingered in my memory, a soft imprint of warmth and familiarity. I realized then how carefully both women were measuring their interactions with me, not out of malice or hesitation, but with a quiet curiosity, an unspoken invitation to observe, to understand, to perhaps participate in the subtle dance forming between us. We talked about mundane things, books, the weather, the little renovations the widow had been making around the house, but every pause, every glance carried weight. The widow leaned slightly closer when she spoke, as if to share a secret, her fingers briefly grazing mine when she handed over a folded napkin. Her friend's gaze followed, soft and attentive, and I felt caught between two centers of warmth, both equally inviting, both equally unattainable in their restraint. It wasn't just the touches that mattered, it was the silences. When the conversation lulled, the quiet that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with the unspoken awareness of proximity, the way our bodies subtly adjusted to each other's presence. I noticed the way the widow's eyes would flicker toward me when her friend laughed, and the way her friend's posture seemed to relax when I responded with a soft smile. At one point, I moved to pour tea for all three of us. The widow's hand hovered near mine, a light brush against my wrist as she steadied the cup, while her friend's eyes met mine over the rim of her own teacup, a spark of playful intrigue in her gaze. It was a delicate balance, affection and restraint, warmth and curiosity, attraction and propriety. I felt both a thrill and a nervousness, the kind that comes when every gesture, every glance, seems to matter more than it should. By the time we settled around the small kitchen table, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. The initial awkwardness of my arrival had melted into something more intricate, more alive. I was no longer just a visitor. I was a participant in a quiet, unspoken connection, a triangle of attention and curiosity that held potential, tension, and something profoundly human. And as I watched the two women exchange a brief, knowing look, I realized that this morning, this unassuming visit, had already begun to change the rhythm of all our lives. The day moved on, sunlight stretching through the tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the warm glow. We had migrated back to the living room after tea, sitting in comfortable silence. The widow's hands were clasped loosely in her lap, her gaze lingering on the faded photograph of her late husband on the mantel. There was a quiet weight in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. "I still find it strange, coming home to all this silence," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear, almost as if speaking aloud made her memories more tangible. Her fingers traced the edge of the picture frame. "Sometimes I feel like he's just in the next room, waiting to tell me not to fuss over the house so much." I shifted slightly closer, my hand brushing hers ever so lightly as I gestured toward the frame. It was a small, almost accidental contact, but her fingers lingered against mine, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her presence, the weight of her trust in that brief, fleeting touch. Her friend, noticing the subtle tremor in her voice, placed a hand on her back, a comforting, grounding gesture. I watched how naturally the widow leaned into it, a quiet sigh escaping her lips, and I realized how much strength could be conveyed in a single touch. The room felt smaller, warmer, almost cocooned in the intimacy of shared vulnerability. "You've been helping her through this, haven't you?" the widow said suddenly, glancing at me with eyes that seemed to weigh my intentions. I felt a soft rush of awareness, the kind that makes your pulse quicken in the quietest moments. I nodded, unsure how to articulate the mix of admiration, curiosity, and something more complicated that I felt toward both women. Her friend's gaze met mine, calm yet probing. There was no judgment, only an almost playful acknowledgement of my place in this delicate triangle. She smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her hand lingering near mine as if to subtly test the waters. The tension was quiet but palpable, like a held breath, and I felt caught between wanting to retreat and wanting to linger, to become part of this fragile, unspoken closeness. For a moment, none of us spoke. I felt the warmth of both women in the same room, the widow's hand subtly pressing against mine in gratitude, her friend's gaze inviting, quietly magnetic. The silence was full, almost charged, an unspoken acknowledgement that something significant had shifted. I realized that the morning's arrival, the small touches, the shared glances, had moved beyond mere familiarity. In that quiet moment, I felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness, admiration, and subtle desire, not in a reckless or overwhelming way, but as a recognition of deep, human connection. Both women were revealing pieces of themselves to me, and in return, I found myself opening to them, even as I silently acknowledged the complexity of this growing intimacy. By the time conversation resumed, soft, meandering, gentle, it was clear that the energy in the room had changed. Something delicate had been shared, a confession not of words, but of trust and attention, of hearts slightly more aligned than they had been hours before. And in that gentle shift, I felt the slow, steady pull of connection that neither time nor propriety could easily undo. The afternoon unfolded with a gentle, unhurried rhythm, as though the house itself had decided to slow its pace to match ours. The three of us had moved to the kitchen to tidy up after tea, and in the warmth of the sun streaming through the window, I noticed the small, intimate ways we began to interact. There was no rush, no agenda, only shared activity, and in it, an intimacy that gradually wove itself between us. We worked together arranging the dishes, and my hand brushed the widow's as I reached for a plate. The touch was brief, almost accidental, yet the warmth that radiated from her skin lingered longer than expected. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers seemed to hesitate for a heartbeat, as if considering whether to maintain the connection. I felt my own pulse quicken at the subtle acknowledgement, the small, unspoken tension that made the air between us feel charged. Her friend joined in, moving beside me to dry the cups. At one point, her shoulder nudged mine lightly as she reached past me, and a soft laugh followed. A playful, teasing sound that made the room feel more alive. The faint scent of her perfume, mingling with the lavender that always seemed to linger in the house, reached me in waves, warm and inviting. She met my gaze over the rim of a cup, and for a second, the world outside the kitchen seemed to fade, leaving only the three of us, connected by the simplicity of these shared motions. It wasn't just the touches, it was the small, unintentional gestures that carried meaning. The widow leaned closer when explaining where to store a stack of dishes, her fingers brushing mine as she guided me. Her friend rested a hand lightly on my shoulder to steady herself, and I felt the reassuring weight of her presence without a word being spoken. Every movement, every glance, seemed deliberate yet effortless, a quiet choreography of proximity and attention. We paused to organize some potted herbs on the windowsill, and the widow tilted a small plant pot toward me, her hand brushing my wrist ever so gently. Her friend mirrored the gesture, offering a small, encouraging smile as I adjusted the plants. The simplicity of the task made the touches feel natural, almost innocent, yet beneath the surface, a subtle current of connection flowed between us. Laughter came easily, soft, genuine, and unforced. When a leaf fell into the sink, all three of us leaned toward it at the same time, hands brushing briefly in a small tangle of warmth. I caught the fleeting look in the widow's eyes, and then in her friend's, and felt a flutter of awareness at the delicate triangle forming around me. It was a warmth that felt safe, inviting, yet tantalizingly intimate. By the time the chores were done, the room hummed with quiet satisfaction. We lingered near the counter, leaning slightly toward each other, the air filled with unspoken acknowledgement. It was a shared moment, not just of work, but of subtle connection, a reminder that intimacy can exist in the simplest of gestures, the brush of a hand, the overlapping warmth of bodies in a small space, and the quiet joy of being seen, truly seen, by others. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long, warm streaks across the living room. Everything felt slower now, the ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of the curtains, even the quiet hum of the street outside. Yet in this quiet, the tension between the three of us was impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but a subtle, almost magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer, each movement weighted with unspoken possibility. It began with a minor moment of vulnerability. The widow had picked up a photograph of her late husband, her fingers tracing the outline of his face, and a faint sigh escaped her lips. "Sometimes I forget how much I miss him until it hits me all at once," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no dramatics, no crying, just a raw, honest acknowledgement of loss that made the air feel heavier, more intimate. Without thinking, I reached out to steady her hand. The brief contact sent a warmth up my arm that I couldn't ignore. Her fingers lingered against mine, a fleeting touch that was soft, deliberate, and grounding. I felt the subtle quiver in her hand, the faint tremor of emotion that belied the calm she tried to maintain. Across the room, her friend's gaze held me, steady and probing, her hand brushing lightly against her own arm in quiet encouragement. There was a silent dialogue happening, a conversation without words that left me both exhilarated and slightly breathless. Her friend moved closer to offer reassurance, placing a hand on the widow's back. The widow leaned into it instinctively, her head tilting slightly toward the warmth. I watched, struck by the quiet intimacy of the gesture. And yet, as their connection unfolded, I felt a magnetic tug toward both of them simultaneously. Their attention toward me was subtle, a shared acknowledgement of my presence in this intimate moment, as if they both wanted me to feel included in the delicate equilibrium forming in the room. The tension built in tiny gestures, a hand brushing against mine while passing a teacup, a shoulder grazing lightly as someone adjusted their position, a glance exchanged across the space that lingered just a second too long. Each touch, each look, carried weight far beyond its simplicity. I felt caught between wanting to withdraw in caution and wanting to lean in, to become part of the warmth, the closeness, and the quiet magnetism between us. For a moment, all three of us sat in silence. The widow's hand remained near mine. Her friend's eyes met mine over the rim of her tea, soft and knowing. There was no need for words. The tension had reached its peak, not in drama, but in intimacy, in the silent acknowledgement of connection, trust, and desire restrained by propriety. In that quiet, charged moment, I realized something undeniable. Our hearts were quietly aligned, though not without hesitation. Every glance, every brush of skin, every soft laugh had built to this subtle crescendo of longing and trust. And as the sun sank lower, casting a golden glow across the room, I understood that this moment, the intersection of vulnerability, affection, and magnetic tension, would define the path forward for all three of us. The quiet triangle we'd formed was no longer tentative. It had become alive, vibrant, and undeniably present. The evening had settled into a quiet, golden calm. Sunlight, softened by the curtain's gentle sway, spilled across the living room, turning the air into something warm, almost tangible. The tension of the day, the subtle brush of hands, the lingering glances, the quiet confessions, had evolved into a calm intimacy that wrapped around the three of us like a familiar blanket. It felt less like an event and more like a natural unfolding, the gentle culmination of hours spent in shared presence. We had drifted into the living room after tidying the kitchen, carrying mugs of tea that still radiated comforting warmth. The widow settled into the armchair, her body relaxing in the familiar softness, while her friend took the sofa, leaning slightly toward the center, as though naturally leaving a space for me between them. I felt the invitation in the arrangement, subtle but unmistakable, and instinctively moved closer, letting my shoulders brush theirs lightly. The widow's hand found mine first, her fingers curling around mine with a delicate steadiness. The warmth of her touch was grounding, a quiet reassurance that spoke louder than words. Simultaneously, her friend's gaze met mine, soft and knowing, and her hand brushed against my back ever so lightly, a touch that was fleeting, yet full of intention. In that moment, I felt the magnetic pull of both of them at once, a simultaneous comfort and spark of awareness that made the room feel alive with unspoken understanding. We laughed softly at a shared memory the widow recalled, and her friend's eyes sparkled as she chimed in, gently teasing both of us. The sounds were easy and unforced, full of the quiet joy that comes from companionship and trust. The warmth of the room, the mingling sense of tea, and the lingering hint of lavender made every gesture, every glance, every touch feel amplified, intimate, and meaningful. At one point, the widow leaned her head lightly on my shoulder, her hair brushing my cheek. It was natural, tender, and entirely human, a gesture of trust, vulnerability, and comfort. Her friend, noticing the closeness, reached over to rest her hand gently on my arm, a soft, grounding presence that complemented the widow's intimacy. I felt surrounded by care, by affection, by a connection that was at once profound and delicate. For a long moment, none of us spoke. There was no need. The quiet in the room was filled with the rhythm of our shared breathing, the gentle pressure of hands and shoulders, the warm light that made the space feel private, suspended, almost sacred. It was a connection born of hours of shared presence, of small touches, fleeting glances, and unspoken understanding. As the light faded into evening, I realized that the triangle that had begun with surprise and subtle tension had transformed into something real, tender, and deeply human. Both women were here, fully present, fully aware of each other and of me, and I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't anticipated. The warmth between us was comforting, electric, and steady all at once. In that quiet, golden room, I understood that we had reached a new chapter, one of mutual trust, affection, and slow-burn intimacy that could grow at its own pace. It wasn't a story of haste or impulsive desire, but of patience, care, and connection. And in the gentle clasp of their hands, in the soft smiles we shared, I felt an unspoken promise that from this day forward, we would navigate the delicate beauty of this bond together, hearts quietly aligned, and fully aware of the warmth we had found in one another.